it's to coasts and oceans that we're going to turn next with the final environment that Felipe Fernàndez-Armesto discusses, which is oceans, breaking the wave, the domestication of the ocean. Oceans, of course, are environments too, as we are only too tragically becoming aware, with great islands of plastic everywhere, congealing together as noxious islands somewhere in the Pacific. But oceans require ideas and technologies and fortunes to travel across and to make a life in, and yet can they sustain civilizations? And as I said, Dave Abulafia has a magnificent study of the different ocean and the comings and goings of civilizations across those different oceans. In particular, I guess the Indian Ocean was perhaps the first, maybe arguably the first great ocean. Oceans also have a specific geography of position and define environmental, geological, geographical constraints of wind patterns and currents that have an enormous and often unacknowledged impact on why some civilizations grew successfully and why some did not. The first great real ocean crossings were, I guess, the extraordinary adventures of the Polynesian navigators across the Pacific, which are superbly recounted in David Abulafia's book, The Boundless Sea, and well worth a read. And perhaps I might even do an episode of the podcast at some point on the navigators of the Pacific, including, I think his name was Tupaia, who was the Polynesian navigator who accompanied James Cook on various of his adventures, and they together mapped many parts of the Pacific. And then, of course, there's the Indian Ocean, which was for many millennia perhaps the most significant ocean in which civilizations communicated around the coasts, with the travel and the trade between China and India and the east coast of Africa. And then, of course, there was the Atlantic Ocean, which initially clung to its rather cold weather, wind-beaten shores in its early centuries, to finally break out from its western peninsulas of Europe to cross the Atlantic and discover anew the Americas, and to then forge this strange thing known as Atlantic or Western civilization. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that, partly just quickly on the series of events that led Columbus to discover America, and perhaps more importantly to discover the trade, the wind patterns and the current patterns of the Atlantic, and of Vasco da Gama to find a way around, the sort of tip of Africa to India and back, opened up centuries of transoceanic civilizational contact. And there have been many, many, many explanations proffered for the long-term consequences and dominance of this. But certainly in Felipe Fernàndez-Armesto's view, at least one part of that has to do with the strange environmental conditions of the oceans themselves. It was not just the peculiarly wonderful ideas of the peoples of Western Europe, or the uniquely combative character forged in centuries of internal intracontinental conflict of the peoples of Europe, all their spirit of adventure and truth-seeking based in Christianity that led them to this route. It was partly the peculiarities of the oceans itself. As Felipe Fernàndez-Armesto says, the Atlantic is a peculiar ocean, and Atlantic side position, especially in Western Europe, confers advantages unattained elsewhere, whereas the Indian Ocean is a sea where navigators look inward to within the monsoonal system and the sea lanes between the storm belts. The trade winds of the Atlantic reach out to the rest of the world. The route discovered by Columbus linked the densely populated middle band of Eurasia, which stretches from the eastern edge of the landmass to the shores of the Atlantic, with the environs of the great civilizations of the New World, which lay just beyond his reach on the other side of the ocean. The frustration of the Indian Ocean and the fulfillment of global ambitions in the Atlantic have to be explained in part with reference to the inescapable facts of geographical determinism, the tyranny of the winds. It took a long time for navigators to crack the Atlantic wind code, but once the task was accomplished, the winds drew them on towards other oceans and other cultures. And it's really this little process of cracking the code of the trade winds, the Atlantic, that conferred such advantage on what we know as the West, or the Anglo-American world, or the Atlantic civilization. The three voyages of Columbus, John Cabot, and Vasco da Gama effectively cracked the code of the Atlantic wind system. Instead of an obstacle to the expansion of European peoples along its seaboard, the ocean became a means of access to previously unimaginable empires and trades. The European West was thrust beyond its historic confine. In the short term, the breakthrough of the 1490s made Atlantic civilization possible. Navigators now knew the routes of reliable, regular communication between the western shores of the Old World and the eastern shores of the New. The Atlantic, which had been a barrier for the whole of recorded history, now became a link. This is a really crucial event and fundamental, I guess, to our understanding of the last 500, 600 years, and not irrelevant, I guess, to a lot of what's going on here. We are seeing the conflict between the Atlantic world and Eurasia appearing again. And it opened up a fundamental process of passage of ideas, people, money, resources, plants, animals between Europe or Eurasia and America and Africa. That, I guess, defined Atlantic civilization, defined as much by the sort of tea trade between England, India and America as the slave trade between Africa, America and Europe, as the growth and development of all the good things that we understand by Atlantic civilization under the term Western civilization. That very, very, very strange concept of Western civilization, defined really, I guess, as the projection out of Western Europe onto America and then onto the rest of the world. But it's not the nature of the ideas of Western civilization that explain the unique advantage, perhaps, that those countries had at that time, at least not alone. It was this unusual access to favourable winds and currents of the Atlantic and Atlantic Ocean. The fact that the Atlantic Ocean became as Fernàndez-Armesto says, a highway to the rest of the world. From the northwest edges of the ocean, its wind systems provided easy access to the great wind-borne thoroughfares that cross the world. Atlantic winds lead naturally to those of other oceans. But of course, the days of travel by sea and limitation by current in today's world of air travel and super powerful shipping ships sort of long gone. And the unique advantage that bred the Atlantic civilization, the Atlantic Western civilization, is falling away. And perhaps also some of the bonds between the different parts of Western civilization are falling away. Towards the end of Felipe Fernàndez-Armesto's book, written I think in around about 2004, he discusses the potential breakup of the Atlantic world and refers to the bombing of Serbia in 1999 by NATO, referring to the years after the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. He writes that in the end, America beat the Soviet Union in what was in effect a competition in spending power, because only a capitalist economy could afford guns and butter. Meanwhile, however, America never felt secure enough to revert to isolation. The fortress in which the West withstood communism was sustained by the pillars of the Atlantic Alliance. Western Europeans grumblingly accepted in their own interests a role for most of their territory as America's first line of defense, scattered with American bases, bristling with American weapons. Atlantic civilization huddled around the ocean for its defense. The last great age of Atlantic solidarity may appear, in hindsight, as a response to self-perceived weakness. And perhaps the level Fernàndez-Armesto fought in early 2000s of European and American cooperation seemed to be weak. But the response of the NATO alliance to Serbia was, in his view, rather poorly handled. The operations were so mismanaged and so counterproductive that they made the Europeans and Americans mutually wary and recriminatory. The Kosovo operation exacerbated the war, accelerated massacres, and rewarded terrorists. It left a legacy of resentment among the innocent victims of NATO bombing in Serbia and Montenegro, and a $100 billion cleanup. Though NATO propaganda tried to justify it as a war for civilization, it was really undertaken to save face. When the Atlantic Alliance finally breaks down and Western civilization is split by political schism, this thoughtless warmongering may be seen as one of the acts which deservedly condemned it, exposing its flaws, undermining its civilized credentials. And of course, as you may be aware, there has been a few references to those events in the current Indian summer of the Atlantic Alliance in the fight for civilization against Russia in Ukraine, where Europe and America, at least for a while, appear to be tighter than they ever have been before, and yet there is perhaps a legacy of deep resentment and a fissuring of the relationship that is being seeded. But I will come back to that theme in another episode, because it seems to bring up the issue of whether the West has passed its peak, whether we're about to see the fall of the West, and hence to the broad story of the rise and fall of civilizations. And it's to that theme that I'm going to turn in the fourth and final part of this epic mini-series on civilizations in the next episode. Okay, so thank you so much for listening to my program. Please share and subscribe and leave me a 5-star review on iTunes. Tell your friends about the podcast. And I do hope that, notwithstanding predictions of the fall of the West, you'll keep yourselves safe and well, and remember that what thou lovest well will not be reft from thee. Bye now.